The boundary had been crumbling for years, though no one could say exactly when the first stone fell. It seemed as if the wall had always been like this, tired, leaning, weathered by time and neglect. It no longer kept anything in or out, no longer served the purpose for which it had been built. Where once it stood proud and impenetrable, marking the limits of a world, now it sagged in quiet defeat. Moss had claimed its cracks, vines twisted through its fissures, and weeds rooted themselves in the spaces where mortar had loosened. Time had turned it porous, not just in structure but in meaning. It was no longer a boundary, not in any real sense. It had become a memory, an artifact from an age when boundaries were believed to be permanent. Yet even in its decay, the wall commanded attention. It carried the weight of what it had once signified. This was not merely stone. It was a marker of intention, of human will impressed upon the earth. Someone had built it long ago with purpose, staking a claim, defining a space, and deciding who belonged inside and who would remain outside. And perhaps that is why its crumbling felt so heavy. Its decay did not simply represent the passing of time. It was a quiet undoing of decisions once made with certainty. It was the unraveling of authority, the fading of human control. To walk along the wall now was to feel both awe and sorrow. In some places, whole sections had fallen, leaving only jagged teeth of stone protruding from the soil like the remains of an ancient jawbone. In others, the wall stood tall but hollow, its center eaten away by years of rain and heat, the stone flaking like brittle parchment. Birds nested in its cavities. Small animals scurried through its gaps. It had become less of a barrier and more of a sanctuary for the unnoticed creatures of the earth. Its purpose had shifted without consent, repurposed by nature for survival rather than division. And beyond this crumbling skeleton of stone lay the space it once enclosed. A garden, or at least what used to be one. If you squinted hard enough, you could still see its bones. The faint grid of pathways overrun by grass. The outlines of what had been beds for flowers, and the remains of a one-sprout fountain now dry and choked with leaves. It was a space that still hummed faintly with memory. The air seemed to remember the fragrance it once carried. The soil seemed to recall the touch of careful hands. There had been beauty here, and even in its ruin. Some of that beauty lingered like the echo of a song long forgotten, but not entirely lost. The wall had kept the beauty once. It had framed it, protected it, and separated it from the world beyond. But now that it was failing, the distinction between inside and outside was gone. The wild had begun to creep in. Where there had been roses, there were now thorns. Where there had been neatly trimmed hedges, there were brambles. The wind, once softened by ordered rows of trees, now whipped through in chaotic gusts. And yet, there was something oddly liberating in this overgrowth, as if the garden had shed its constraints and decided to live by its own rules. What was once curated was now wild, and in the wildness, there was a kind of defiance. Perhaps that was what unsettled the people who came to see it. They stood on the edges of the ruin, looking at the decayed wall and the untamed garden, feeling both nostalgia and unease. They did not say it aloud, but they understood on some instinctive level that they were witnessing not just the collapse of stone, but the collapse of an idea. Boundaries, they saw, are not eternal. They may hold for years, even centuries, but they are not immune to erosion. They crumble when neglected. They crumble when the purpose they once served is forgotten. They crumble when nature or time decides it is no longer interested in honoring the lines humans have drawn. Some of them thought of the people who had built this wall. What drove them to erect such a barrier? Was it protection? Pride? Fear? Did they build it to keep others out or to keep themselves in? Whatever their reasons, those people were gone now, their intentions buried under layers of earth and memory. All that remained were stones, steadily surrendering to gravity, and the faint impression of hands that once worked tirelessly to set them in place. The wall outlasted its makers, but it could not outlast the slow, patient pull of time. And what of the garden? Some said it should be restored. They spoke of clearing the weeds, rebuilding the wall, and returning the place to its former order. But others disagreed. They saw in its wildness a different kind of beauty, one unplanned, untamed, and deeply alive. They argued that the crumbling wall was not a failure, but a lesson, that boundaries are temporary, that no matter how tightly we try to contain life, it will always find a way to spill over. The wall, silent as it was, seemed to agree. Each crack, each fallen stone, each creeping vine told a story of resistance, of nature reclaiming what had been parceled off. It had been built to separate, but now it united. It blurred the distinction between cultivated and wild, between human-made and earthborn. It became a reminder that nothing we build stays entirely ours. If you stood close enough, you could feel the wall breathing. Not literally, of course, but in the way it interacted with the world. It held warmth from the sun, exhaled coolness at night, and absorbed the sounds of birds and insects. It had become part of its surroundings, no longer an imposition, but an integration. What had once been rigid now bent toward harmony. In this way, the wall was no longer just a crumbling boundary. It was a testament to transformation. And maybe that was the point all along. Maybe the wall was never meant to last forever. Maybe its purpose had been fulfilled long ago, and its crumbling was simply the natural conclusion of its story. Human beings like to believe in permanence, but permanence is an illusion. Walls fall, gardens grow wild, boundaries shift, and yet, in that impermanence, there is meaning. The crumbling boundary teaches us that nothing, no matter how carefully constructed, can withstand the endless passage of time. But it also teaches us that there is beauty in decay, that there is freedom in what emerges when our walls fall. Perhaps that is why people still come here, to this ruin. They are drawn not just by curiosity or nostalgia, but by recognition. In the wall, they see themselves, the boundaries they've built, the ones that are failing, and the ones they long to let go of. They see the futility of trying to control everything and the quiet grace of surrendering to what is. They see the garden beyond, overrun but vibrant, and they wonder if maybe, just maybe, letting things grow wild isn't such a terrible thing after all. The crumbling boundary does not offer answers. It does not justify its decay or apologize for it. It simply stands or leans, or falls as it is. And in doing so, it asks us to consider our own boundaries, to question the walls we've built in our lives. Are they keeping us safe, or are they keeping us confined? Are they still serving their purpose, or have they become monuments to things we no longer need? In the end, the wall teaches us this: that boundaries crumble, but life goes on. And sometimes, when the stones fall and the vines creep in, what emerges is not ruin, but possibility. Echoes of laughter. It is a deceptively light phrase, one that might conjure images of joy, of children running barefoot through sunlit fields, of friends gathered around a table as night deepens and conversation grows easy, or of a family sharing a meal in the kitchen where walls are close enough to carry every chuckle, every playful word. Yet when we speak of laughter as echoes, we are already in the realm of memory. The sound is no longer present, only its trace remains, lingering in the walls, the air, and the mind. Echoes are not whole voices. They are fragments, reverberations that remind us of what has been lost or left behind. In this way, the very phrase echoes of laughter is tinged with nostalgia, with that bittersweet ache of knowing that joy once filled a place but has since departed, leaving only its ghosts to dance in the silence. When one walks into an old house, they often feel these echoes without truly hearing them. There is a warmth to spaces that once held life, as though the walls themselves have memory. The creak of the floorboards is not just what's shifting with age, it is a reminder that feet once crossed those very planks in moments of carelessness and purpose. To imagine echoes of laughter in such a place is to bring it back to life. To picture the rooms alive with the energy of people who loved and lived fully. Perhaps this is why we speak of echoes at all. They are our way of keeping that life present, even when its sources have long gone. Yet echoes are also incomplete. They reach us distorted, distant, and often fading before they are fully grasped. The The laughter they carry is not the bright, immediate kind that fills a room. It is softened by time and distance. This gives it a dual nature. It is both beautiful and painful, both a comfort and a wound. To hear echoes of laughter is to be reminded that there was once joy, but also that we are only witnesses to its shadow. It is a reminder that all moments of happiness are fleeting, that what is now will one day become a memory, perhaps only an echo for someone else. In villages, in towns, and in cities, laughter often weaves itself into the very fabric of public spaces. Courtyards, markets, schools, they become repositories for these echoes. Even after people have left, their voices seem to hang in the air. Children's laughter, especially, has a way of embedding itself in a place. It is bright and unrestrained, and when it fades, it leaves behind a silence that feels heavier than any storm. There is something almost sacred about the contrast, the knowledge that joy was once so abundant that it could leave traces strong enough to outlast time. When villagers gather in a square, telling stories of the past, they often speak of such laughter, of festivals, of weddings, of games played in the streets. The echoes they hear are not merely sounds but the emotional imprints of their own lives, preserved in memory and passed through whispered recollection. But there is a reason why echoes often feel lonely. They remind us of absence. Laughter is meant to be shared, to exist in the immediacy of togetherness. When it becomes an echo, it implies that the moment of connection has passed. Perhaps the people who laughed are gone, moved away, grown old, or buried beneath the soil. Perhaps the spaces themselves have changed, transformed by time, or by hands that care little for what they once were. The echo persists, but it cannot bring back the living moment. It becomes instead a bridge between what was and what remains, a reminder that while joy can pass, its memory lingers stubbornly in the air. Philosophically, echoes of laughter invite us to reflect on the nature of joy itself. We rarely appreciate laughter when it fills a room because we are immersed in it, swept along by its immediacy. But in memory, when it is only an echo, we experience it differently. It becomes precious, even sacred. We recall the tilt of a friend's head as they laughed, the cadence of their voice, and the way that laughter loosened the heaviness in our chest. We realize then that joy is not a constant state, but a fleeting, fragile visitor, and that part of its beauty lies precisely in its transience. An echo of laughter is thus both an elegy and a celebration that mourns what has passed, while also immortalizing the fact that it existed at all. Echoes also belong to places as much as they belong to people. Old walls, whether in homes or gardens or abandoned schools, hold these sounds in their very structure. A child running through a schoolyard decades ago leaves behind something intangible, but real, a residue of energy, a memory inscribed in the atmosphere. This is why people who revisit their childhood homes often feel overwhelmed. Even when those homes are empty, they hear those echoes in their bones. They hear their younger selves in conversation with ghosts of parents, siblings, and friends who are no longer there. This is why certain places seem alive with memory. They carry within them the imprints of laughter that once filled them, even if only as faint whispers now. In literature and art, echoes of laughter often appear in moments of great poignancy. They are a way for authors to capture the collision of past and present, the way memory interrupts the stillness of now. Think of novels where a protagonist walks through a forgotten garden and imagines the laughter of those who once gathered there, or where a grieving character hears their loved one's voice and a half-remembered dream. These echoes become both comfort and torment. They assure us that we were once happy, that joy was real and tangible, but they also remind us that we can never fully return to it. For communities, echoes of laughter can function as a form of collective memory. In villages, elders tell stories of harvest festivals, of marriages celebrated with dancing and feasts, and of nights when songs and laughter filled the streets until dawn. For the younger generations who never lived through those times, the echoes exist through these retellings. They may not have heard the original laughter, but they inherit its resonance. In this way, laughter becomes not only personal, but also cultural. It becomes a thread that ties generations together, a sound that survives in memory even when its sources are gone. There is also something inherently human about the act of preserving echoes. We build monuments, write diaries, and record voices all to hold onto things that time would otherwise erase. Echoes of laughter are a more subtle preservation, less deliberate, but no less powerful. They live in the way we recall a loved one's chuckle at a mundane joke, or how we remember the exact sound of our siblings laughing together during childhood games. They live in the way a community recalls the exuberance of celebrations long past, or the way an old couple recalls the giggles that once filled their home when it was alive with children. These echoes are proof that laughter, even after it fades, still shapes us. And yet, echoes are fragile. They can be lost if they are not remembered. A village that forgets its festivals, a family that forgets its stories, a person who buries their own past too deeply, all of these can silence the echoes. This is why storytelling becomes so essential. When we speak of the past, we summon its echoes. When we laugh in remembrance, even through tears, we bring those echoes back to life. They stop being just fragments of sound and become part of our present again, if only for a moment. To call this part echoes of laughter is to recognize that what we are dealing with is not simply joy, but joy refracted through time, memory, and loss. It is a way of honoring what came before, of acknowledging that even when laughter is faded into silence, it still leaves traces strong enough to shape us. It reminds us that the most meaningful joys are often those that stay with us as memories, haunting us gently, urging us to remember who we were when we laughed so freely. Perhaps this is why echoes of laughter often make us both smile and ache. They carry us back to moments when we were lighter, freer, untouched by the heaviness that came after. They remind us of the people who brought the laughter out of us, many of whom may no longer walk beside us. They remind us that time is relentless, that the rooms that once rang with joy may now stand empty. And yet, they also remind us that we were there, that we lived, that we experienced something worth remembering. In this way, echoes of laughter are not just memories. They are proof of life, proof that joy existed, that connection existed, that somewhere in our personal or collective history, there were moments so full of living that they left a resonance behind. And in listening for those echoes and honoring them, we find not just sadness for what is past, but gratitude for what was, and perhaps even hope that such sounds might fill our present and future once again. Silence can be many things. It can be oppressive, like a heavy curtain drawn across the possibility of speech. It can be sacred, like the hush inside an old chapel where centuries of prayer still cling to the walls. It can be mournful, the quiet that follows loss, or restorative, the quiet that precedes growth. But the silence of a keeper is different. It is intentional, weighted with the knowledge of what must not be spoken. When we speak of the keeper's silence, we are entering a space where quiet is not emptiness, but presence, a deliberate act of holding back, of preserving, of guarding something too fragile or too dangerous to name aloud. This is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of knowing too much. To understand this silence, we must first understand the keeper. A keeper is not merely a caretaker of objects or places. They are custodians of meaning, memory, and sometimes of pain. The keeper stands at the threshold between the past and the present, holding on to what others have forgotten or chosen to abandon. Their role is both simple and impossible: to ensure that something, a story, a place, a relic, a truth, does not vanish. But this work changes them. The keeper becomes shaped by what they keep. They become a vessel of histories too dense to speak easily, of memories that do not belong fully to them but live within them nonetheless. This is why their silence matters. It is the only language strong enough to hold the unspeakable. Silence, in this context, becomes an act of preservation. Words can distort. They can shrink vastness into manageable sentences, flattening out the complexities of what they describe. The keeper, standing before the immensity of what they guard, knows that speaking might diminish it, so they remain silent. This is not cowardice. It is reverence. It is restraint born of respect for the thing kept, whether the thing is a crumbling ruin, a sealed archive, a forbidden memory, or a grief so deep it resists expression. Yet this silence is not without cost. For the keeper, the burden of holding what must remain unspoken can be isolating. They exist apart from others, not because they wish to, but because they must. To be a keeper is to stand watch over the inexpressible, to feel its weight pressing against the limits of your own being, while knowing that no one else can quite share the burden. It is a quiet existence, but not a peaceful one. There is tension in it between the desire to speak and the need to stay silent, between the human longing for connection and the sacred obligation to remain apart. This silence also transforms how the keeper relates to time. While others move forward, the keeper remains anchored. They are not fully in the present because part of them lies in what they guard in the past, in the memory of those who came before, in the essence of what must not be lost. Their silence is a bridge across centuries. It collapses the distinction between now and then. They do not merely keep, they become what they keep, embodying its history in their stillness. In this way, their silence becomes a living archive. And what of the thing kept? Though unnamed in this sentence, we can feel its gravity. It could be a physical place of forgotten temple, a library of forbidden texts, or a burial ground too sacred to disturb. It could be intangible, an old story passed down through whispers, a grief that cannot be public, a truth about the world that others are not ready to hear. Whatever it is, it commands a silence strong enough to bend the keeper to its will. It says, "Guard me. Do not let me be consumed by the noise of the world." And the keeper obeys. But there is another dimension to this silence. Power. To keep something, to withhold it, is also to possess a form of authority. The keeper knows what others do not. They decide what stays hidden and what, if ever, is revealed. This makes their silence both protective and dangerous. Protective because it shields what is vulnerable from those who would exploit or misunderstand it. Dangerous because silence can also become a weapon, a means of control, of denying access to knowledge or history. The keeper, then, walks a delicate line. Their silence can sanctify, but it can also imprison. From a philosophical perspective, the keeper's silence challenges our assumptions about truth and speech. We live in an age that prizes transparency. That equates speaking with liberation and silence with repression. But what if silence is sometimes the truer form of expression? What if some things cannot survive the violence of being named? The keeper's silence forces us to confront this paradox. It asks whether speaking always serves truth or whether sometimes the only way to honor what is real is to let it remain in the quiet. There is, too, a profound humility in the silence. The keeper does not insert themselves into the story of what they guard. They do not claim authorship or ownership. They simply hold. They create space for what is larger than themselves. In a world obsessed with declaring, posting, and performing, the keeper's refusal to speak becomes a radical act of resistance. It says, "Not everything is mine to tell. Not everything is yours to know." Yet for the wanderer, the one who passes by sensing history in the cracks, as in the previous image, the keeper's silence is both a challenge and an invitation. It dares them to look closer, to listen more deeply. The silence becomes a threshold you can enter, but only if you are willing to slow down, to shed your assumptions, to dwell in mystery. The keeper will not hand you answers. They will only hold the door open for you to find them yourself. There is something profoundly human in this dynamic between keeper and silence. We all, in some sense, are keepers. We all carry untold stories, unspoken griefs, and memories too heavy for words. We know what it is to keep silent because to speak would be to risk shattering something fragile. In this way, the keeper's silence becomes a metaphor for the quiet acts of endurance we all perform, holding our pain, our love, and our truths until the world is ready, or perhaps until we are. And yet, the silence of the keeper is not eternal. There is always the question of when, if ever, they will speak. Silence can guard, but it can also suffocate. A time may come when what has been kept must be shared, when the act of keeping transforms into an act of release. This is the keeper's dilemma, knowing when silence protects and when it destroys, when it honors and when it betrays. Their role, then, is not only to hold but to discern. Perhaps this is why the keeper's silence feels so heavy. It is not empty and quiet. It is a silence filled with the weight of choice, of responsibility, of history itself. It is a silence that hums with the voices of those who can no longer speak, with the presence of things that demand reverence. It is not a silence of absence, but a fullness so full it cannot be reduced to sound. In the end, the keeper's silence leaves us with more questions than answers. What is being kept? Who is the keeper? Why this silence, and for how long? But perhaps that is the point. The keeper's silence is an invitation to dwell in mystery, to confront the limits of our knowing, and to honor the vastness of what cannot be neatly resolved. It reminds us that not all stories are ready to be told, and not all truths can be carried by words. Sometimes, the deepest acts of keeping are done in the stillness between them. The wall stood as it always had, unmoved, a silhouette against an ever-changing sky. Yet to say it stood would be to simplify what was happening. It did more than endure. It absorbed. It collected time as a tree collects rains, as if the passing of each season etched another silent story into its stone. It had once been raised with intentional line of purpose carved into the earth by hands that believed in borders, in safety, in the permanence of what they were building. But purpose is not an eternal thing. Purpose fades when the people who gave it meaning are gone, and so the wall had grown into something else entirely. A relic, a monument, a hollow frame of something that used to matter but no longer does. Abandonment does not come as a single moment of desertion. It arrives like ivy, creeping, patient, inevitable. One day, the builders stopped coming to reinforce the stones. One day, the voices that filled the air fell silent. One day, the paths leading to the wall are overgrown, left untended until they vanish completely. It begins subtly. This process, a gate rusts, a stone slips. A gap forms where once there was unbroken continuity. And then the wall, once strong and whole, begins to fracture. But no one notices, or perhaps they do, and they simply choose not to care. After all, what is one wall to the world? What is one fading structure in a landscape filled with newer, louder things? The seasons kept coming, but they did not come for the wall. They came for themselves, indifferent to what remained in their wake. Summer, with its merciless heat, bleached the stones and baked the earth around them, as though trying to strip them of their history. Autumn followed, its brittle winds tearing leaves from the skeletal trees nearby, leaving the wall even more exposed, more naked in its loneliness. Winter crept in with its heavy silences, filling the cracks with ice that swelled and split the mortar, a quiet violence done in cold, unseen hands. And then came spring, bringing rain that didn't clean, but corroded, pulling with it bits of stone and soil, making the wall smaller, weaker, even as the world around it turned green and alive. This cycle repeated itself endlessly, and in that repetition, the wall became something more than abandoned. It became a witness. It had seen the faces of those who built it and the backs of those who left. It had seen lives begin and end, seasons change, and entire eras slip through its fingers like sand. But in all of this, no one came back. That is the strange thing about abandonment. It carries with it an illusion of possibility. At first, there is hope that someone will return to fix, to tend, to care. But as time stretches, hope transforms into memory, and memory into myth. Those who might have returned either cannot or will not. They move on. They forget. They die. The wall stays, but only because it has no choice. It exists in a kind of suspended animation, not alive enough to matter, not dead enough to be erased. There is a cruelty in this, but also a strange kind of beauty. For though the wall has been left behind, it has also been freed from its original purpose. No longer does it serve as a boundary. No longer does it stand as protection or prison. It has become a canvas for the elements, reshaped not by the will of its makers, but by the slow hand of nature. Moss crawls where there was once smooth stone. Vines clutch at its cracks like desperate fingers. Small animals burrow in its foundations, unafraid of what it once symbolized. The wall has been claimed, not by people, but by the very seasons that erode it. But does this transformation make it whole? Or does it simply underscore the emptiness of its survival? To rebuild something is not the same as reviving it. You can replace stones, reinforce mortar, make the wall stand taller than before. But height does not give it a soul. It may look renewed, but it is only pretending at life. Like rebuilding a body with no heart inside. The wall may stand, but it does not live. And yet, even in this hollowness, the wall matters. Abandoned structures hold a kind of power that living ones do not. They tell the truth about impermanence, about how even the most carefully constructed things are at the mercy of time. They force those who look upon them to confront their fragility. There is a strange intimacy in standing before something that has been left behind. To imagine the hands that built it, the dreams that justified its creation, and the silence that followed. When those dreams were no longer enough to sustain it, the wall is not just stone. It is a vessel of memory. It carries the echoes of laughter from those who first built it, the shouts of those who once defended it, and the quiet footsteps of those who abandoned it. It is haunted, not by ghosts, but by history itself. But why does it still stand? Why has no one come to take it down? Perhaps because to destroy it would be to acknowledge its irrelevance, to admit that what it once represented no longer matters. Or perhaps because those who remain cannot bring themselves to erase it. Abandonment, after all, is a softer violence than destruction. To destroy is final. To abandon is to leave open a door that no one intends to walk through. And so the wall remains not out of reverence, not out of utility, but out of the inertia that governs all forgotten things. It is easier to let it decay quietly than to choose its fate. Easier to let the seasons claim it than to take responsibility for what it has become. But in its stillness, the wall endures as a reminder. It reminds us that everything we build, no matter how strong, can become an artifact of abandonment. It reminds us that time does not need our permission to rewrite our work. And perhaps most painfully, it reminds us that neglect often leaves deeper scars than deliberate destruction. It waits not for the ones who left, not for those who will never come. It waits simply to be seen again, to be acknowledged as more than a ruin, as more than a hollow gesture, to be understood as something that lived, that mattered, even if only for a moment, before it was left behind. A shadowed threshold. Few words carry as much quiet weight as these. A threshold is not a place one lingers in, at least not for long. It is a space of in-betweenness, neither inside nor outside, neither beginning nor end. It exists to be crossed, a point of passage, a moment of transition. Yet when we qualify it as shadowed, everything changes. This threshold is not illuminated. It is obscured, darkened, perhaps even foreboding. Its purpose, to allow movement between spaces, now feels slowed, interrupted, held in suspense. A shadowed threshold is not simply a doorway. It is an image of hesitation, of holding one's breath before stepping into the unknown. It is a symbol of those moments in life when we are neither where we were nor where we are going, and when the next step feels as heavy as the one that brought us here. To begin, let us sit with the word threshold. At its simplest, it is the plank of wood or stone beneath a doorway. But in literature, philosophy, and even ritual, the threshold has long been more than that. It is a liminal space, a point of crossing that carries profound symbolic weight. In ancient cultures, thresholds were sites of both welcome and danger. They marked the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between home and wilderness, between safety and risk. Stepping over a threshold was often ritualized. The Romans believed that brides should be carried over the threshold of their new homes to avoid bad luck. In Japanese tradition, the Jinkan entryways wear shoes, and symbolically, the impurities of the outside world are left behind. A threshold is always a place of negotiation, a pause before entering new territory. It is the space where you gather yourself, decide who you will be on the other side, and whether you will cross at all. But what happens when this threshold is shadowed? Light invites us forward. Shadow halts us. A shadowed threshold is not only a place of passage, it is a place of uncertainty. The darkness obscures what lies beyond. Is this a threshold to sanctuary or danger, renewal or ruin? In this way, the shadow becomes an agent of hesitation. It makes the crossing fraught, forcing us to feel the weight of the step we are about to take. Shadow here is not just a visual phenomenon, it is an emotional one. It evokes fear, doubt, memory, and the lingering presence of the past. Shadows, after all, are always cast by something. What looms behind us that stretches across this threshold? What grief or guilt or unresolved history darkens the doorway we stand before? This is not just a physical crossing, it is a psychological one. Consider how thresholds appear in our lives. They are rarely literal. They are those moments of transition where we know that one chapter has ended, but the next has not fully begun. The hours after a funeral, when grief lingers but life has not yet reshaped itself around loss. The quiet after a breakup, when the room feels both too empty and too full of memories. The days after leaving a job or a home, when the future is unformed and the past still clings to us. These are shadowed thresholds, the in-between places of human experience where clarity does not come easily. They are places of reckoning, where we cannot go back but are not yet ready to go forward. There is also something of memory and a shadowed threshold. Shadows are traces of form without substance, echoes of what once stood in the light. They suggest that the past still casts itself into the present. In this way, a shadowed threshold could be the point at which we confront what we thought we had left behind. Before we cross into the new, the shadow of the old insists on being acknowledged. This is why thresholds are often moments of deep emotional intensity. They bring us face to face with what we carry, our hopes, our regrets, our unfinished stories. They demand that we recognize the weight of all that has brought us here before we step into what comes next. Yet the shadow does more than obscure. It also transforms. In shadow, shapes lose their sharpness. Boundaries blur. What seems solid becomes fluid, undefined. This makes a shadowed threshold an especially potent metaphor for transformation. To stand in shadow is to be unmade, at least temporarily. It is to be in a space where identities and roles slip, where certainty dissolves, where we are forced to confront who we are when the familiar lights no longer guide us. This is frightening, yes, but it is also an invitation. A threshold that is brightly lit asks nothing of us but to cross. A shadowed one demands that we pause, that we attune ourselves to what cannot be immediately seen or understood. It asks us to enter the unknown as we are, stripped of the illusions of control. There is an inherent tension in thresholds. They are both boundaries and openings. To call a threshold shadowed heightens this tension. It makes the crossing feel like a test. Can we step into what we cannot fully see? Can we trust that beyond the darkness lies something worth entering? In this way, a shadowed threshold becomes a deeply existential image. It captures the condition of being human, that we are constantly asked to step into futures we do not know, carrying pasts that still stretch their shadows over us. It is the moment before every major change, the breath before confession, the silence before saying goodbye. It is where the self is most raw, most uncertain, most alive. There is also a spiritual dimension to such an image. Many religious traditions frame thresholds as places of initiation. To cross a threshold is to undergo a rite of passage, to leave behind an old self and emerge transformed. But the shadow complicates this. It suggests that the crossing may not feel like illumination, at least not immediately. It may feel like loss, like wandering, like being held in darkness. This is why mystics and poets often speak of nights of the soul, those periods when we stand at the edge of something greater, but cannot yet see it. The shadowed threshold is not failure. It is the necessary pause before rebirth. It is the quiet gestation before the new self takes shape. From a narrative standpoint, This phrase could anchor an entire story. Imagine a protagonist who has come to a literal threshold, a door, a gate, a portal, knowing that everything beyond it will change them, yet unable to see what awaits. The shadow makes the threshold both terrifying and irresistible. It is the classic moment of the hero's journey, the crossing of the first threshold, where the ordinary world gives way to the extraordinary. But here, instead of triumphal clarity, we are given shadow. This makes the story less about conquest and more about vulnerability, the raw, human truth of not knowing what comes next, yet standing on the edge anyway. The phrase "a shadowed threshold" also resonates with architectural and emotional imagery. Think of the way shadows pull in old doorways at dusk, how they seem to hold their kind of history. Think of abandoned buildings, their thresholds darken, inviting but unsettling. Think of personal thresholds, the doorway of a childhood home revisited after decades, shadowed not by the sun but by the memories it holds. These thresholds do not simply lead us into new spaces, they lead us back into ourselves, forcing us to encounter the parts of us that we thought we had left behind. And yet, the shadow does not mean the absence of hope. It means that hope is deferred, hidden, waiting. A shadowed threshold is not an impassable one. It requires courage, the courage to step without full knowledge, to cross without the safety of perfect light. This is why the image lingers, because it feels true to how transformation happens. Change rarely comes with fanfare or clarity. It comes in moments when we are afraid, unsure, and yet compelled to move forward. It comes when we stand at a shadowed threshold and decide, despite everything, to cross. In the end, a shadowed threshold is a place of profound significance. It is the pause between what was and what will be, the quiet reckoning before a leap, the moment when we confront the depth of our fears and longings. To stand in such a place is to be fully human, aware of our smallness, our uncertainty, our mortality, and yet willing to reach toward whatever lies beyond. It is an image of grief, of courage, of faith. It reminds us that life is made not only of the rooms we inhabit, but of the thresholds we dare to cross, even when they are shadowed. The rebuilding began quietly, almost timidly, as if those who initiated it were still uncertain whether such a thing should even be attempted. There had been years, perhaps decades, of abandonment before this moment, years in which the garden beyond the boundary had been left to the mercy of time, and the wall that once enclosed it had crumbled into a jagged skeleton of stone and moss. People had passed by without stopping, glancing at the ruin, but never truly seeing it, until its disrepair became part of the landscape, not an eyesore, not a treasure, simply a fact. And then, one day, someone decided to rebuild. It began with clearing debris. Stones that had long ago fallen from the wall were gathered, dust brushed from their faces as if waking them from a long sleep. Weeds that had sprouted defiantly between the cracks were pulled by hand, their stubborn roots resisting until the last moment. The builders who arrived here worked not with the urgency of conquerors, but with the patience of caretakers. They were not the same as those who had built the original wall. They did not have the same dreams, nor did they carry the same burdens. These new hands came to the task with a mixture of reverence and detachment, reverence for what had been, detachment from the pain of losing it. They did not grieve the wall, they rebuilt it, and yet, even as the first stones were placed, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that this new wall could never be the old one. Its stones were different, taken from other quarries and cut by other tools. Its mortar smelled faintly of lime and clay, but fresher, lacking the centuries-old patina of its predecessor. Some who watched the rebuilding resented this whispering, that no matter how carefully the stones were laid, no matter how faithfully the old designs were followed, this would always be a copy, an echo of the original boundary, not its true heir. Others, however, believed this was the point. Why rebuild a wall only to pretend nothing had changed? They argued that the wall, like the garden, must evolve with time and must carry both its history and its present. The work was slow. Rebuilding always is. Each stone had to be chosen carefully, its weight measured, and its angles examined to ensure it fit into the larger whole. There were days when the laborers worked in silence. The only sounds the scrape of stone against stone, the rhythmic thud of hammers, and the soft sigh of wind threading through the skeletal trees of the overgrown garden. On other days, their voices carried laughter, arguments, songs weaving themselves into the structure as surely as the mortar did. As the wall grew higher, it began to hold these sounds the way it once held the whispers of the garden, as living echoes, pieces of human presence embedded into the stone itself. Rebuilding is not simply about restoring what was. It is also about deciding what will be. There were debates heated at times about how faithful the reconstruction should be. Some insisted on preserving every detail of the old wall, wanting it to stand exactly as it had in the past, a monument to what had been lost. Others argued for change, wider gates, stronger foundations, and even slight alterations in height and shape. They wanted the wall to be functional for a new age, to protect not what once was, but what could be. In the end, compromise won, as it often does. The wall would keep the old lines, the familiar curves, and the same stones were possible. But it would also bear the marks of the present, subtle, but undeniable. And still, as the wall rose, so did the garden stir. It had been waiting, dormant but alive, for someone to pay attention to it again. The overgrowth that had choked the pathways was cleared, but not entirely. The builders chose to leave some of the wilder parts, acknowledging that time had added its own beauty here. Old roots, once thought dead, sprouted tender shoots. Flowers bloomed in unexpected corners, seeds having slept undisturbed for years in the quiet dark. It was as if the garden knew what the rebuilding meant, not just a return to what was, but an invitation to live again. Rebuilding requires more than stones and labor. It requires vision, and vision is complicated. Those who placed the stones each carried their own idea of what this wall would mean. To one, it was a boundary to keep danger out. To another, it was a frame, holding the garden like a precious picture. To someone else, it was an act of defiance, a way of proving that time could not completely erase human intention. And for some, perhaps most quietly of all, it was simply an act of healing. The wall had fallen. Now it stood again. Something broken was being made whole. Yet, there was unease among the onlookers. Whispers rose. Why rebuild a wall at all? Wasn't its collapse a sign that walls, boundaries, enclosures, divisions are temporary for a reason? Couldn't the garden remain open, free from the constraints of stone? But for all these questions, the work continued. Because rebuilding, like remembering, does not wait for unanimous agreement. It moves forward because someone believes it must. And so, stone by stone, the new wall grew. It wasn't perfect. There were flaws, small misalignments, stones that cracked under pressure, and mortar that dried unevenly in places. But those imperfections gave it character, grounding it in its newness. Perfection was never the goal. Continuity was, and perhaps resilience. Rebuilding, after all, is an act of defiance against loss. It is a way of saying, we refuse to let this place, this memory, this meaning vanish. But it is also an acknowledgement of loss, a quiet admission that what is being built can never truly be what once was. The builders understood this. They did not seek to erase time. They sought to converse with it. Each stone they placed was a word in that conversation, bridging past and present. As the days turned to weeks and the wall inched higher, a curious thing happened. The boundary that had once been about keeping things apart began to bring people together. Children came to watch the building, their laughter spilling into the garden. Elders shared stories of the wall as it once had been, offering memories as gifts to those who had no first-hand knowledge. Even strangers paused in their journeys to observe the work, perhaps sensing that something significant though quiet was happening here. Rebuilding is never just physical. It is emotional and spiritual. The new wall carried more than stone. It carried the weight of hope, the desire for restoration, and the courage to face impermanence. It carried the understanding that some boundaries are worth remaking, not to divide, but to define, to honor, and to protect. And when the final stone was placed, there was no grand ceremony, no trumpets, no crowds, just the quiet satisfaction of hands that had worked and a wall that now stood whole. The garden, enclosed once more, exhaled as if in relief. And for a brief, fleeting moment, the builders, the onlookers, and even the stones themselves seemed to understand. Rebuilding is not about recreating the past. It is about giving it a future. Story is in the mortar. It is a phrase that feels like an incantation, a call to look closely at walls, at the spaces between the stones, at the hidden veins of history that hold up the structures we pass without thought. Mortar is the substance that binds, that makes many fragments one. But it is also the quietest part of any wall. We notice the stones, the bricks, and the carved reliefs. Rarely do we notice the material that holds them together. And yet, it is there, filling the gaps, steadying what would otherwise collapse. To speak of stories in the mortar is to imagine that those gaps, those seemingly invisible spaces, carry the imprints of those who built, touched, and lived within those walls. It is to acknowledge that even the smallest, most overlooked parts of our world are repositories of human life, storing echoes of voices that once filled the air. There is an old belief in some cultures that buildings absorb memory, that laughter, anger, grief, and whispered secrets seep into their very materials, imprinting themselves on stone and wood like faint fingerprints that can never be washed away. If that is true, then mortar, humble, porous, and everywhere, is among the greatest keepers of such memories. It does not boast. It does not announce itself with decorative flourish. It simply holds, quietly, and in that holding it gathers stories of the hands that mixed it, of the laborers who pressed it between stones under a relentless sun, of the children who ran their fingers over its drying surface, of the lovers who leaned against those walls in twilight and exchanged words too soft for others to hear. To imagine stories in the mortar is to re-enchant the built world, to recognize that our histories are not only written in books or carved into monuments, but embedded in the spaces we inhabit, in the substance that binds them. When villagers gather to watch a wall, as they do in our imagined scene, they are not only looking at stone and mortar, they are gazing at a ledger of their own existence. The mortar, rough and weathered, might hold the story of a time when the wall kept out wind instead of people, when its purpose was to protect a garden of roses now turned to dust. Those villagers, with their quiet murmurs, are engaging with those stories. Whether they know it or not, they see the repairs where mortar has been patched in a different color, a reminder of the storm that cracked the wall 10 winters ago. They see the darker streaks where water ran down during floods. They feel with their fingertips the uneven ridges made by generations of workers, each with their own callous hands and unspoken dreams. Each imperfection in the mortar is a story, every grain a fragment of human persistence. There is a particular poetry in thinking of mortar as a storyteller. Bricks and stones are like characters, solid, bold, each with its own distinct identity. Mortar, however, is the narrator, the connective tissue that turns many individual pieces into one living whole. It tells of collaboration, of unity forged out of difference. Its stories are not loud or obvious, but whispered, the way old people tell family histories around firesides, half spoken and half felt. When you press your hand against an old wall, you are touching not just an object, but a vessel of memory, a physical archive of sweat, decisions, compromises, and labors. That wall, through its mortar, has witnessed more than any living person could recount. And yet, most of those stories will never be told. That is the tragedy and the beauty of the mortar. It is full of life, but voiceless unless someone listens. This is why memory work storytelling, restoration, and preservation becomes vital. When elders point out the places where the wall was first built, they are giving voice to what the mortar has been holding silently for decades or centuries. When a historian runs their fingers along crumbling joints, they are reading like one reads a text, decoding the past through texture and composition. Even when someone sits quietly beside a wall and imagines who has stood there before them, they are engaging in a dialogue with the mortar, pulling its dormant stories into the present. The phrase stories in the mortar also carries a lesson about humility. Mortar is overlooked precisely because it is not meant to stand out. Its function is not to shine, but to serve. Yet, without it, no wall would stand. Likewise, the most enduring stories of a place are often those of ordinary people, laborers, mothers, children who did not demand attention, but whose quiet contributions held up the very structure of life. These are the stories not found in official records, but passed down in whispers, stored in the mortar between grand events. The hands that built the wall may never be named, but their work endures. Their lives, however unremarkable to history books, remain inscribed in the fabric of that wall. Mortar, by its very nature, speaks of resilience. It endures storms, heat, frost, and time. It cracks, yes, but even those cracks tell stories of the ground shifting beneath it, of pressures both natural and human. In an old village wall, you can read generations like chapters. The original mortar weathered to a pale chalk. The newer repairs darker or lighter in tone, signaling more recent interventions. The sections where someone used cheaper materials because that was all they could afford. And the careful restoration done by a mason who took pride in honoring the original craft. Each layer is a testament to survival, to the community's ongoing negotiation with time. This view of mortar as a living archive also reframes our understanding of ruins. When a wall crumbles, when the mortar turns to powder, it is not merely decay, it is a final act of storytelling. In its erosion, the mortar reveals its layers, the materials used, the techniques employed, and the conditions it endured. To archaeologists, such ruins speak. To descendants, they ache. They remind us that even in disintegration, there is narrative. That which falls apart still tells us something about what once was. In many ways, the stories in the mortar mirror our own. Human beings, like mortar, often exist in the in-between spaces between generations, between larger forces that shape our lives. We are rarely the stones, the celebrated landmarks of history. More often, we are the binding substance, quietly holding together families, communities, and traditions. And like mortar, our stories risk being overlooked unless someone pauses to see us, to hear us. To think of ourselves as mortar is humbling but also deeply affirming. It is to recognize that, though we may not stand out individually, our presence gives strength and coherence to the greater whole. There is also an intimacy in mortar. It is made by human hands, often in communal labor. In older times, villagers might have gathered to mix lime, sand, and water, each contributing to the making of a wall that would shelter them all. That act of making is itself a story, one of cooperation, of shared purpose. And those who live within the walls, who touch them daily, leave new imprints, new layers of narrative. Children scratching their initials into drying mortar, a mason leaving an unnoticeable mark that only another craftsperson might recognize. A grieving widow leaning her forehead against the wall. For comfort, all of these are absorbed into the life of the mortar. In thinking about stories in the mortar, one must also confront the tension between memory and silence. Mortar holds everything but cannot speak for itself. It relies on interpreters, on villagers, historians, and poets to translate its quiet endurance into language. Without them, the stories risk being lost. This is why oral traditions are so powerful. The whispered recollections of elders, the tales passed down in kitchens and courtyards, the small commemorations that take place before forgotten walls, these are ways of giving voice to the voiceless, of letting the mortar stories breathe. Ultimately, the stories in the mortar are about belonging. They tell us that every wall is more than a boundary. It is a witness. It has seen the changing seasons of human life, births, weddings, funerals, betrayals, and reconciliations. Its mortar holds all of it without judgment, binding together not just stones but the fragments of humanity that pass through its shadow. When we look closely, when we run our fingers along those weathered seams, we are not only touching history, we are being reminded that we are part of a continuum, that our own stories will one day be held in the quiet places of the world, waiting for someone to notice. And so, to walk along such a wall, to imagine its mortar is full of untold stories, is to feel time collapse. Past and present coexist in the roughness under our fingertips. We become, for a moment, part of the very narrative the wall is telling. The villagers whispering at its base know this instinctively. They do not need academic frameworks or official records. They sense that the wall remembers them, that its mortar holds their ancestors' laughter, labor, and grief. And in that recognition, there is both sorrow for what is past and a profound comfort, the knowledge that nothing, not even the smallest fragment of a life, is truly lost when it has been built into the world so deeply. Boundaries are strange things. They are both lines of protection and invitations to cross. They can be drawn in the earth, in the mind, and in the heart. They can be visible, like walls and fences, or invisible, like the quiet, unspoken rules that govern how we exist with one another. To reclaim a boundary is to acknowledge that at some point, it was lost, taken by force, surrendered by choice, or eroded by neglect. This reclamation is not merely about redrawing a line on a map or staking a claim to space. It is about reasserting oneself, one's identity, and one's right to define what is inside and what must remain outside. It is an act of restoration, but also of transformation. When we speak of boundaries, we often think of them in the physical sense, the perimeters of land, the borders of nations, and the spaces we call ours. But boundaries are not only material. They exist in every human relationship, in every cultural encounter, and in every act of becoming. They define where I end and you begin. They mark what I allow in and what I keep out. They shape who I am. When these boundaries are violated, the wound runs deep. It is not only an intrusion, it is a theft of selfhood. To reclaim them is to heal. But reclamation is never simple. It requires a reckoning with what allowed those boundaries to slip away in the first place. Were they taken violently, in a way that left scars? Were they relinquished quietly, perhaps in the name of love, compromise, or survival? Were they ignored altogether, assumed unworthy of defense? Each origin story of a lost boundary carries its own weight, its own pain. Reclaiming it means looking at that pain without flinching. It means acknowledging where one's edges were blurred and having the courage to sharpen them again. There is a profound courage in this. For many, setting or reclaiming a boundary feels like betrayal, as though saying no or enough means turning away from others. But in truth, boundaries are not walls of separation. They are structures of respect. They are the way we honor our humanity and make space for others to honor theirs. Without them, we are not whole. We become fragmented, living at the mercy of other people's needs, expectations, and demands. To reclaim a boundary is to say, I will no longer disappear inside of you. I will stand where I begin, and I will hold the ground. And yet, boundaries are rarely reclaimed without conflict. Those who benefited from their absence will resist their restoration. They will call it selfishness. They will accuse you of cruelty. They will say you are no longer who you used to be. And they will be right, you aren't. You are no longer the version of yourself that lived without edges that allowed others to spill unchecked into your soul. Reclaiming the boundary means stepping into a new identity, one forged in self-respect and shaped by the refusal to be erased. This reclamation is not only personal, it is historical. Throughout time, oppressed peoples have reclaimed boundaries stolen by colonization, war, or exploitation. They have fought not only for land, but for the right to name themselves, to tell their stories, and to exist on their own terms. In this way, the personal act of reclaiming a boundary echoes across generations. It becomes part of a larger narrative, one where survival transforms into sovereignty. And it is also deeply spiritual. To reclaim a boundary is to say, I am sacred. It is to treat one's life, body, and soul as ground too holy to be trampled. It is to stand like an ancient gatekeeper, allowing in only what serves growth and barring what would destroy. This is why so many spiritual traditions speak of boundaries not as divisions, but as necessary containers for flourishing. A garden without boundaries becomes overrun. A heart without boundaries becomes broken. But boundaries are not static. They breathe with us. To reclaim them is not to build impenetrable walls. It is to create living thresholds, doors that can open and close with discernment. This is the subtle art of reclamation, knowing when to let the world in and when to keep it at bay. It is a dance between connection and preservation, intimacy and autonomy. It is worth asking, why do we lose boundaries in the first place? Sometimes it is fear of rejection, fear of being alone, fear of angering those we love. Sometimes it is conditioning growing up in families or cultures that taught us our worth depended on compliance, on saying yes even when it crushed us. Sometimes it is hope, the belief that if we give enough, bend enough, and break enough, we will finally be accepted. But eventually, we learn that a life without boundaries is not really a life. It is a slow erasure. And so comes the turning point, the moment when a person decides to reclaim the boundary. It rarely comes gently. Often, it comes like a storm. It comes when the cost of silence outweighs the comfort of keeping the peace. It comes when the body begins to ache from carrying too much. It comes when the soul, long neglected, finally whispers, "No more." This moment is not always triumphant. It is often lonely, frightening, and full of doubt. But it is necessary. Reclaiming the boundary is also about reclaiming voice. For too long, the silence that accompanied the boundary's loss became a prison. Speaking, even trembling, uncertain speaking, becomes the first act of liberation. This is mine. This is who I am. This is what I will allow. These words are not only declarations, they are rebirths. They teach the world how to meet us anew. And perhaps most importantly, reclaiming the boundary allows us to see others more clearly. When we define our edges, we can honor theirs. When we respect our own humanity, we can extend that respect outward. Boundaries are not selfish. They are the architecture of authentic connection. Without them, relationships become consumption. With them, they become communion. So what does it mean, truly, to reclaim the boundary? It means taking back what was always yours. Your right to exist without apology. Your right to hold space for your needs. And your right to shape the contours of your life. It means no longer being a guest in your own skin. It means standing firm, even when the ground shakes. Even when the old voices call you back to the comfort of collapse. And it means this: the boundary, once reclaimed, becomes more than defense. It becomes a sanctuary. It is no longer merely a line you draw. It is a home you build, one that shelters your becoming, nurtures your growth, and allows you to step into the world whole. It was never supposed to look like this. The wall, the tower, the broken veins of stone across the landscape, none of it resembled the vision first sketched out by hands long gone. Once, there was a blueprint. Once, there were minds who dreamed of permanence, of symmetry, of a structure that would define not only time, but also the chaos of the world outside it. The blueprint must have been perfect when it was drawn, crisp lines inked on parchment. Every measure exact, every angle deliberate. There was purpose in those marks. A quiet confidence that what was planned would become something enduring. But blueprints are fragile things. They survive only as long as someone believes in them. And belief is the first thing to go. Somewhere between the drawing and the building, between the raising of stones and the slow erosion of decades, the blueprint was forgotten. Maybe it was misplaced, tucked into an archive that no one opens anymore. Maybe it was burned, deliberately or by accident, its paper curling to ash before anyone could copy it. Or maybe worse, maybe it still exists, folded and untouched, a document no one cares enough to read. Whatever the case, what stands now is a body without memory, a structure severed from the idea that gave it birth. The blueprint was the soul. The wall is only the shell. The tragedy of forgetting a blueprint is not only that the design is lost, but that the intention behind it dies too. A wall without its blueprint becomes a wall without context. It might as well have been built by anyone for anything. Was it meant for defense, for beauty, for keeping the outside world out, or for protecting what was within. No one can say anymore. The original logic, the dream of its builders, has dissolved. What remains is only function without meaning, or worse, function without function. A shape in the landscape doing nothing but existing, and yet, it's human nature to try to guess. We stand before abandoned things and invent stories for them, as though our imagining could replace the truths we've lost. Some passersby may think the wall was once a fortress, built to keep out invaders. Others may decide it was a garden wall surrounding some long-forgotten estate, a place of laughter and abundance. Some may even choose to believe it was purely decorative, an attempt at beauty that failed under the weight of neglect. Each guess is as meaningless as the last, because without the blueprint, we are only speculating, projecting our own desires onto a structure that cannot answer back. And perhaps that is why no one tries to take it down. To destroy it would be to give up entirely on the question of what it was meant to be. To tear it apart stone by stone would be to admit that the blueprint, the dream, is truly gone, that the wall's mystery is unsolvable. So it stays tall and hollow, not because it serves a purpose, but because no one wants to face the grief of finality. The seasons do their work on it as they do on all forgotten things. Rain seeps through its cracks. Moss spreads like a slow infection. Trees root themselves in the soil at its feet as if trying to claim it back for the earth. But the wall does not fall. It leans. It fractures. But it does not give way. It resists because it does not know how to do anything else. And with every day it remains standing, the forgotten blueprint becomes more mythical. It becomes a ghost story among archivists, an object of idle curiosity for historians, and a whispered rumor for those who walk past. There was a plan once. There was meaning once. But no one remembers now. This is the quiet cruelty of human work. We build as though our work will live forever, but without context, without memory. Even our most carefully constructed creations turn to puzzles. What we call permanence is often just a shell awaiting misunderstanding. The forgotten blueprint becomes a mirror of our own impermanence, our tendency to lose track of why we do the things we do, to let our intentions erode until only the motions remain. And so the wall stands, not as the proud completion of a design, but as the monument to what happens when design is abandoned. It is the proof that even the most precise lines can fade, that even the most careful plans can vanish into dust, leaving behind structures that outlive their meaning. Perhaps, if someone could find the blueprint, they could breathe life back into it. Perhaps the wall could become whole again, not merely standing, but belonging to something. But no one searches, no one digs through the archives, no one asks the old questions. It is easier to let it stand as it is, stripped of purpose, than to confront what we've lost. And so the blueprint remains forgotten, and the wall, well, it remains too tall, silent, and hollow. A wall without purpose. The phrase sounds deceptively simple, yet when one lingers on it, it opens into a vast meditation on function, abandonment, memory, and the nature of things that remain after their use has passed. A wall is, by design, purposeful. It is a structure meant to enclose, to protect, to divide, to hold up, or to hold back. It exists to serve, whether as part of a fortress, a home, a garden, or even as a boundary between one idea of belonging and another. But to strip a wall of its purpose is to make it strange, to transform it from an instrument into an artifact, from a functional object into a mute relic of something lost. A wall without purpose does not simply stand, it lingers. It is not alive, yet it stubbornly resists erasure. It invites us to wonder, what does it mean for something that once mattered to remain, after its reason for existence has gone? And perhaps more hauntingly, what does it mean for us when we see ourselves reflected in that wall? At the core of this image is dissonance. A wall is defined by what it does so when it no longer does anything, when it holds nothing in or out, when it supports no roof. When its boundary separates nothing meaningful, it becomes an unsettling thing. It stands not as part of a whole, but as a fragment, a reminder of something incomplete. We often encounter such walls in ruins, a crumbling stone barrier in the countryside, marking where a house once stood, a decaying fortification whose city no longer exists, a lonely garden wall with no garden, overtaken by wild growth. They persist long after the living have gone, long after the world has stopped needing them. In that persistence lies their poetry. A wall without purpose is not erased by irrelevance. It stays, and in staying, it demands to be acknowledged. Yet the purpose of a wall is rarely neutral. Walls are bound up with human intentions, to keep some in, to keep others out, and to delineate who belongs and who does not. When those intentions disappear, the wall itself is left hollowed out. It is like a word without meaning, a gesture without context. And this opens a profound interpretive space. A wall without purpose becomes a canvas for projection. We, as observers, supply meaning to its existence. When we stand before a ruined wall, we imagine the lives it once touched. We fill its emptiness with stories of families sheltered behind it, of battles fought along it, of hands that built it stone by stone. In this way, the wall without purpose paradoxically gains a new one, to remind, to evoke, to haunt. It stops being merely functional and becomes memorial. The psychological dimension of this cannot be overlooked. To encounter a wall without purpose is to be confronted with the passage of time and the impermanence of human endeavor. It reminds us that all our constructions, physical, emotional, and social, are temporary. The fortresses we build to keep ourselves safe, the walls we raise to hold our identities intact, even the boundaries we draw between us and them, eventually, they will stand as hollow shells, stripped of their function, awaiting reclamation by time and nature. In this sense, the wall without purpose is a memento mori, a stark reminder of how easily the things we create outlast us and how quickly their meanings unravel once we are gone. But perhaps the most haunting part of this phrase is not what it tells us about walls, but what it tells us about ourselves. How often do people feel like walls without purpose? We define ourselves by what we do, our work, our relationships, and our roles. When those roles are taken away, when our work is done, or when we are no longer needed, what remains? Like the wall, we may find ourselves standing in a space that no longer requires us, haunted by the echo of our former utility. Retirees often describe this feeling, the sudden loss of function, the disorienting quiet after years of structured purpose. So do parents when their children leave home, or caregivers when the ones they've cared for are gone. In this way, the wall without purpose becomes a metaphor for human identity, for the unsettling moment when our usefulness is stripped away and we are left to rediscover who we are beyond function. Yet there is another way to view it, one that does not drown in despair. A wall without purpose may also represent liberation, freed from the demands of utility. It simply is. It no longer has to hold anything back or keep anything in. It no longer bears the weight of obligation. In this sense, it becomes purely itself, not a tool, but a being. This interpretation transforms the wall from a symbol of abandonment into one of quiet survival. It has endured the collapse of the structure it once served. It has weathered storms, the shifting ground of history, and perhaps even attempts to tear it down. And yet, it remains. A wall without purpose can stand as a testament to resilience, to the beauty of things that outlast their intended function and take on a new life as witnesses to time. This tension between loss and endurance, between futility and resilience, gives the phrase its emotional power. It invites us to hold to truths at once, that the wall's purposelessness is tragic and yet its continued existence is meaningful in itself. It mirrors the paradox of much of human experience. We long for purpose, yet we often find our deepest truths in the quiet spaces after purpose has gone. Grief itself is like this. When someone we love dies, the roles we held with them vanish. We are left like walls without purpose, standing in a changed landscape. But in that space of purposelessness, we discover new depths of memory, new ways of existing in relation to what we've lost. In this way, the wall without purpose is not empty, but full of what once was, full of what cannot be erased. There is also a historical and cultural richness to the idea. Throughout time, walls have symbolized civilizations themselves. The Great Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall, and the Berlin Wall, these are structures deeply tied to the narratives of power, identity, and division. To call a wall without purpose suggests that its political or social meaning has dissolved. The Berlin Wall today stands not as a divider, but as a relic, its fragments transformed into public art and memorials. In this way, a wall without purpose is not only a ruin, it is a recontextualized artifact. Its very purposelessness opens it to reinterpretation, not as a tool of division, but as a lesson, a canvas, a caution. The spatial dimension of such a wall is equally intriguing. When a wall loses its function, the spaces it once defined merge. What was once inside and outside are now one. Boundaries blur. The wall becomes less an enclosure and more a remnant and odd interruption. In an otherwise continuous landscape, this can feel unsettling but also strangely freeing. In losing its purpose, the wall inadvertently allows for openness. Perhaps this is another metaphor embedded within the phrase that when the structures we build to protect ourselves lose their use, they make room for something new. The end of one function may become the beginning of another. A wall without purpose also teaches us to see beauty in what has been discarded. In ruins, there is a certain elegance. Cracked stone, creeping vines reclaiming their territory. Weathered surfaces softened by time, these details remind us that even purposelessness has aesthetic and emotional value. It invites us to appreciate survival not for what it does, but for what it represents, the dignity of still being here. The wall without purpose, in this sense, becomes a quiet poem in the landscape, one that speaks of endurance, change, and the passage of countless days. Ultimately, the phrase confronts us with questions about the nature of value. Must something be useful to matter? Or is there an inherent worth in simply existing and bearing witness and holding the memory of what has come before? Perhaps a wall without purpose is not purposeless at all. Perhaps its purpose is to remind us of impermanence, to challenge our obsession with utility, and to teach us that survival, even stripped of function, is a form of quiet defiance. In the end, a wall without purpose is an image that resists closure. It can be ruin, memorial, metaphor, or mirror. It forces us to consider the tension between what was and what remains, between our need for purpose and our deeper longing simply to endure. It speaks to the beauty and sorrow of what outlasts us, to the haunting dignity of structures and people who continue standing, even when their original reason for being has long since disappeared. Where flowers once danced, there is only silence now. The garden that had once been alive with color and movement is still, its vibrancy reduced to the muted tones of earth and ash. Yet if you stand there long enough breathing in the quiet, you can almost hear them, the soft rustle of paddles swaying in the wind, the faint hum of bees drunk on nectar, and the laughter of those who once walked here and believed that this beauty would last forever. The ghosts of those flowers linger in the soil, not as visible blooms, but as memory, as something deeper and older than sight. They remain in the way the air tastes different here, rich and strange, like the residue of something sacred. It is strange how absence can feel as alive as presence. You look at the overgrown pathways, at the tangle of brambles that have claimed the fountain's edge, and you feel something beneath it, the echo of life that once thrived in this space. These were not just flowers, they were storytellers. Their stems told of resilience, their blossoms of joy, and their brief lives of the inevitability of change. They grew not only to adorn the garden, but also to teach anyone who would listen the simplest, oldest truth: everything is transient. They danced for a season, knowing their time would end, and yet they bloomed anyway. That was their gift to remind all who saw them that beauty is no less real for being temporary. Now the ground bears no such witness. It is rough, uneven, and strangely unkind. The flowers are gone, their roots long withered or buried beneath the creeping weight of neglect. Yet even in their absence, they have left traces. The soil still carries the chemical memory of their lives. The rain, when it falls, still releases the scent of them, faint but undeniable from the earth. And there are seeds, perhaps, lying dormant, waiting for the right touch of warmth and water to call them back. This is the quiet secret of abandoned gardens. They are never truly dead. They are only sleeping. It is impossible to think of those flowers without imagining the hands that planted them. Someone loved this place once. Someone knelt in this soil, pressing seeds into the dark with the hope of seeing them rise. Someone chose each flower carefully for its color, its fragrance, and its ability to harmonize with others. The arrangement of blooms was not random. It was a language, one now lost to time. The gardener spoke through petals and stems, arranging them into conversations between species. Roses near lilies for boldness and grace, lavender along the path for calm, and marigolds by the edge for protection. And when the flowers danced, they danced because someone once believed they should. Those hands are gone now. Perhaps they aged, growing too frail to tend the beds. Perhaps they left suddenly, drawn away by necessity, never imagining that what they abandoned would be swallowed by wildness. Or perhaps they simply stopped coming one day, the way people sometimes stop caring for the things they once loved, not out of malice, but out of the slow erosion of attention. Whatever the reason, the garden was left untended, and where flowers once danced, weeds took their place. Yet weeds, too, have their stories. They grow where others cannot, surviving in the cracks, thriving in chaos. In their own way, they continue the dance, but it is a different one. It is a dance without choreography, wild and unrestrained, without the delicate balance that once defined this place. They do not harmonize, they compete. And perhaps that is why standing here feels so jarring. The garden has not stopped growing. It has simply lost its rhythm. Still, if you close your eyes, you can imagine it. You can imagine walking down the path when it was still whole, when every step released a burst of fragrance from crushed herbs and warm blossoms. You can imagine how the light fell here, dappled, soft, filtered through trellis vines. You can hear the gentle buzz of insects at work, the distant splash of water in the fountain's basin, and the sound of leaves applauding in the breeze. You can imagine the flowers leaning toward one another, as if in quiet conversation, sharing secrets only they understood. And if you imagine long enough, you realize that this garden was more than a place. It was an act of devotion, a declaration that beauty matters, even if only for a season. That creation is worth the effort, even when destruction is inevitable. The flowers danced because someone wanted the world to feel lighter, softer, and kinder. They danced for no other reason than that they could. Now, the question lingers. Should they dance again? Should this garden be brought back to life? There are those who believe that restoration is a kind of resurrection, that reviving the flowers would honor the ones who came before. They dream of clearing the weeds, of planting new seeds in the same beds, of seeing colors return to this soil. They long to walk here again and feel that the dance has resumed. But others argue that perhaps it is better to leave it as it is, that the stillness speaks in its own way. That absence, too, can teach us. After all, the flowers were always temporary. Their dance was always meant to end. To rebuild the garden would be to deny the truth they embodied. The beauty does not last forever, and that is what makes it precious. The earth seems undecided. In some places, life stirs on its own. A wild violet here, a stubborn daisy there. Flowers that no one planted, returning to remind the soil that it still remembers how to nurture. Perhaps this is the garden's way of grieving, not with silence, but with small, spontaneous acts of defiance. And so the space remains caught between what it was and what it might become. Neither fully alive nor fully abandoned, neither past nor future. It is liminal, waiting for someone to decide whether to let the flowers dance again or to leave their memory undisturbed. But perhaps the decision is not ours to make. Perhaps it belongs to the garden itself. Perhaps, one day, without anyone's intervention, the right rain will fall, the right sun will shine, and seeds long forgotten will awaken. Perhaps the flowers will decide to dance again, not as they once did, but in a new rhythm, one born of time and survival and change. And if the day comes, it will not be a return to what was. It will be something else entirely, something wilder, deeper, and more honest. For flowers, like all living things, do not return unchanged. They carry the memory of what came before, and they grow differently because of it. Until then, the garden waits, and in the waiting, there is a lesson that even in stillness, even in silence, life endures. That where flowers once danced, they may yet dance again. The weight of emptiness. At first, the phrase seems contradictory. How can emptiness, which implies the absence of substance, have weight at all? Yet anyone who has stood in an abandoned house, walked through a deserted village, or sat quietly in a room where laughter once lived knows the crushing presence of what is no longer there. Emptiness is not a void, but a presence in its own right, heavy with memory, with what should have been, with echoes that press down on the soul like invisible stones. To call it weight is to recognize that absence, too, can occupy space, can shape the air, and can cling to the walls and to the people who remain. There is a particular silence that lives in empty places, a silence so thick it feels almost tactile. It does not soothe, it stifles. It is the silence of a once lively marketplace after the stalls have been dismantled, of a family home after everyone is gone, of a village square after celebrations have ended and the last lanterns have burned out. The air in such places carries the residue of life, as though it is still holding its breath, waiting for those who left to return. In this way, emptiness becomes a kind of haunting, not of ghosts in the traditional sense, but of lives and moments that have imprinted themselves so deeply into a space that their absence becomes louder than their presence ever was. The villagers who gather by the old wall know this weight intimately. They may not speak of it directly, they whisper of roses and winds and what the wall once kept out, but they feel it in their bones. They feel it in the way their eyes linger on the cracks where the mortar has crumbled, in the way they avoid stepping too close, as though afraid of disturbing the silence. They know that what surrounds them is not mere emptiness but layered absence, the absence of those who built the wall, of those who tended the roses, and of the very purpose the wall once served. And in that layered absence is grief, both personal and collective. The weight of emptiness is made heavier by memory. It is impossible to feel the full ache of a deserted place without imagining what it once was. An empty courtyard carries the laughter of children who used to play there. A stripped bare room carries the warmth of fires once lit against the cold. A wall enclosing only dust carries the ghost of a garden where roses bloomed. This is the paradox. Emptiness feels heavy precisely because it is not truly empty. It is filled with shadows of the past, with impressions of what has been lost. These impressions do not lighten over time. If anything, they grow denser as memory and imagination intertwine, turning a place into an archive of what cannot be reclaimed. Philosophers have long wrestled with the concept of nothingness. To some, emptiness is a space of possibility, a clean slate. But for those who inhabit its shadow, it is rarely neutral. It becomes a reminder of futility, of how quickly life can drain out of things, leaving behind only husks. It becomes a confrontation with mortality, not only of people, but also of purposes, of dreams, and of the meanings we assign to the structures around us. To stand in emptiness is to feel time in its most brutal form, to realize that everything we fill our lives with, possessions, routines, relationships, is vulnerable to erosion, to abandonment, to silence. And yet, there is an honesty in this heaviness. Emptiness tells the truth that fullness often hides, that nothing we create lasts untouched, that change is relentless, that every wall, every garden, every gathering place will one day stand quiet. Perhaps this is why emptiness frightens us. It strips away the illusion of permanence. It leaves us alone with the reality of impermanence and forces us to acknowledge how small our moments are against the backdrop of time. For the villagers, the emptiness pressing against them is not just physical. It is social, cultural, and spiritual. The wall that once defined their shared life now separates them from what they used to be. Where roses once bloomed, dust collects, and in the dust is the unsettling realization that care for gardens, for traditions, for one another has waned. They may whisper of the past, but the silence between their words is filled with questions they do not dare speak. Who let it come to this? Can it ever be restored? Do we, too, carry some of the blame for letting it decay? In this way, emptiness does not merely weigh on a place. It weighs on the people who remember what the place used to be. To describe emptiness as weight is also to acknowledge its physicality. Anyone who has walked into a room where someone once lived and found it stripped bare knows that hollowness is not light. It presses down on the chest, tightens the throat, and slows the breath. It is as though the air itself has thickened, charged with the presence of absence. This sensation is amplified in communal settings and abandoned church, a closed school, a shuttered marketplace where the emptiness does not belong to one person, but to many. It becomes a collective burden, a shared heaviness that no single villager can name, but all of them can feel. But perhaps the greatest weight of emptiness lies in its silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a meadow at dawn or the hushed stillness of snow, but the kind of silence that magnifies every thought, every memory, every regret. It is a silence that does not soothe but interrogates, demanding that those who remain confront the gap between what was and what is. It is no wonder that people whisper in such places. To raise one's voice feels almost profane, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile membrane of memory that still clings to the walls. And yet, as suffocating as it can be, the weight of emptiness also invites reflection. It slows us down and forces us to look closely at what is missing and why. It makes us ask what it means to preserve, to remember, and to rebuild. For some, it sparks the resolve to fill the space again, to plant new roses, to gather people within the walls, to give the place new meaning. For others, it deepens the grief, making the emptiness feel permanent and unbridgeable. Both responses are part of the human experience of loss, the pull between holding onto what is gone and daring to imagine something new in its place. In this way, emptiness becomes a kind of mirror. It reflects not only the absence before us, but also the emptiness we carry within the unmet desires, the people we miss, and the chapters of our lives we can never reopen. We project ourselves into it, filling its void with our own private ghosts. This is why an abandoned garden or a crumbling wall can move us so deeply. We see in its decay the fragility of our own existence, the inevitability of our own silences. But perhaps the most profound truth of the weight of emptiness is that it is not truly absence. It is memory made tangible, grief solidified, and potential stalled, but still alive. It reminds us that places remember even when people forget. The wall remembers the roses. The garden remembers the footsteps. The air remembers the laughter that once swirled through it. In its quiet way, emptiness insists that what was once full still matters, even if only as a shadow. And so, the villagers gather, feeling the heaviness settle over them as they look at what remains, not just a wall, but the shape of everything that is missing. They stand in silence or whisper softly, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are sharing the weight of what words cannot fully carry. In that moment, the emptiness is not just a void. It is a presence, undeniable and immense, a reminder of all they have lost and all they still yearn for. And perhaps, in bearing that weight together, they find the faintest glimmer of comfort that even emptiness, when shared, can become a bond. There are absences that feel like voids, blank and indifferent. And then there are absences that ache with presence, absences that hum in the walls, cling to the corners of rooms, and drift through the air like a ghost you cannot name. That is what it means to encounter the scent of what's gone. Scent is the most primal of our senses, the one that bypasses language and thought, carrying us straight into memory. It lingers long after everything else has faded, after the voices have quieted, after the objects have been packed away, after the place has grown still. It resists erasure. A scent can haunt you. It can stop you in your tracks, pull you out of the present and drop you into a moment you thought you'd forgotten. It can make what's gone feel suddenly alive again, if only for a breath. The scent of what's gone is more than the fragrance of loss. It is the afterlife of presence. Every place, every person, and everything leaves behind a trace. You can scrub a house clean, repaint the walls, and replace the furniture, and yet open a certain drawer, step into a certain patch of sunlight by the window, and there it is. That faint familiar trace of what used to be. It may smell like dust warmed by time, like paper yellowed with age, or like the faint sweetness of perfume that once clung to a passing figure. It can be the smell of cedar in a closet that no one opens anymore, the lingering smoke of a fire long extinguished, or the musty earthiness of a garden left untended. These scents are not merely odors. They are the fingerprints of life. There is a quiet cruelty in this. Scent keeps us close to what we've lost while reminding us we can never touch it again. Unlike photographs or letters, which you can fold, keep, and return to with intention, scent arrives unbidden. It ambushes you. One moment you are walking through a room or opening a box, and the next you are weeping, overwhelmed by the nearness of someone or something that isn't there. It reminds you that memory does not live only in the mind. It lives in the body, in the way your breath catches, in the way your chest tightens, in the way a forgotten scent can undo you with its sudden intimacy. But there is also something tender in the scent of what's gone. It keeps the past from vanishing completely. It insists that what we love does not disappear without a trace. The dead leave behind their perfumes, their books, and the smell of their clothes folded neatly in drawers. Old buildings keep the scent of their own histories: damp wood, candle wax, smoke, and stone. Even landscapes hold their ghosts, the sea air that still smells faintly of the storms. It is weathered, the fields that carry the musk of work and harvest long ended. These scents are evidence that the past breathes on, refusing total silence. And yet, this scent is not purely about mourning. It can also be an act of reclamation. To recognize the scent of what has gone is to acknowledge that you once lived fully in its presence. It means you are the witness who carries it forward. You are the one who remembers, even when the world has forgotten. The scent becomes a bridge, fragile but real, between you and what was lost. It tells you that the past is not sealed off. It lingers. It seeps. It waits for you to inhale and, in that breath, to let it live again. There is something almost sacred in this. Many spiritual traditions speak of scent as a medium for prayer, memory, and communion. Incense burns not only for its fragrance, but also for its ability to make the invisible felt. In this way, the scent of what's gone turns ordinary space into a shrine. It transforms a forgotten room, an old coat, and a locked drawer into a vessel for memory. You do not merely smell, you commune. You step into a conversation with what has left you behind. But scent also carries boundaries. It fades, it changes, it escapes. You cannot hold it in your hands. This elusiveness mirrors the very nature of loss. What's gone cannot be possessed, no matter how desperately you try. You can only breathe it in, let it move through you, and release it again. Perhaps this is why the scent of what has gone can be both unbearable and healing. It forces you to practice letting go over and over again, even as it reminds you of what you still long for. The wanderer who enters such a space, an abandoned home, a long-closed chapel, a forgotten library, knows this intimately. They breathe in the scent and feel the press of lives that once filled the air. They may not know the names of those who came before, but they sense their laughter, their grief, and their ordinary days preserved in the walls like pressed flowers. It is an unspoken inheritance to be moved by the remnants of those who are no longer here. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of the scent of what's gone. It reminds us that presence leaves marks deeper than time can erase. We live, we love, we leave, but we are not forgotten, not entirely. There will always be traces, carried in the air, waiting for someone to breathe them in and remember. Outside the wall, life never stopped, while the stones inside weathered in silence, and their meaning eroded like inscriptions on forgotten graves. The world beyond remained alive and tamed, unbothered, and utterly indifferent to what had been built. Nature, in its quiet defiance, pressed itself against the wall's edges. Vines creeping upward like fingers intent on reclaiming what was taken. Grass grew wild in the soil that once bore the trampling of boots and wheels. Roots splitting the earth where once there had been paths paved by human hands. Birds made their nests in the crumbling crevices of stone, their songs piercing the heavy stillness like stubborn declarations that life, no matter how small, continues where humans do not. It is strange how quickly nature forgives what humans abandon. Where we see ruins, the earth sees opportunity. Every crack in the wall becomes a home for moss, every fallen stone a resting place for lichen, and every shadow a cool refuge for small animals hiding from the sun. What once was a barrier designed to divide, to protect, or to exclude has become something else, a meeting point between the made and the wild, a threshold blurred beyond recognition. The wall may still stand, but it no longer separates, it no longer defends. Instead, it is slowly dissolving back into the land that bore it, brick by brick, season by season. And perhaps that is the truest form of renewal, not the artificial rebuilding of a structure to its former glory, not the forced preservation of what has already died, but this quiet, an ask for reclamation by the green, creeping hand of the natural world. Nature has no need for blueprints. It does not care for our intentions, our stories, or the meaning we once inscribed onto stones. It fills the forgotten spaces simply because it can. Because emptiness invites life the way silence invites an echo. Standing at the edge of the wall, one can see it, the contrast between what was and what is. On one side, the remnants of human effort, stubborn, unyielding, holding their shape long after their purpose is gone. On the other side, a wildness that bends to no memory, no history, no ownership. Where the wall ends, a forest begins, its trees swaying without thought of the boundaries they cross. The wind does not recognize the wall. The rain does not pause at its edge. Even the roots, unseen and persistent, slip beneath it as though it were never there at all. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson nature teaches outside the wall. That nothing humans build stays separate forever. Our walls may rise high, and our boundaries may feel permanent, but the living world pays no heed to the lines we draw. Time blurs them, softens them, and covers them in green until they disappear entirely. And in that erasure, there is a kind of peace. The wall will fall, eventually, not because anyone tears it down, but because the outside world refuses to let it remain untouched. And when it does, it will not be mourned. It will not be remembered as it was drawn on some long-lost blueprint. It will become soil, and from that soil will grow trees, and the trees will shelter birds, and the birds will carry seeds, and life will spread. Nature outside the wall has always been patient. It knows how to wait. It knows how to reclaim. And when it does not rebuild the wall. It replaces it with something that belongs wholly to the earth. The stillness within. Few phrases are as simple and yet as inexhaustible. At first glance, it evokes a state of peace, a kind of inner quietude where the storms of thought, memory, and fear subside. But stillness is rarely simple. It is not mere silence. It is not emptiness. It is a dynamic, almost paradoxical presence, a way of being that allows us to encounter ourselves and the world without the constant interference of striving, reacting, or running. To speak of the stillness within is to gesture towards something deep and transformative. A state of self that emerges when we cease to chase, when we stop trying to fill the void, when we allow ourselves simply to be. And yet, stillness is also unsettling. To find it requires us to face ourselves without distraction. It is as much a confrontation as it is a refuge. To begin, stillness is often understood in contrast to motion. Our days are full of movement, physical movement from one task to another, emotional movement from joy to frustration to fear, and mental movement from one thought to the next. Rarely do we pause long enough to even sense the quiet beneath this current. But stillness does not mean the absence of movement altogether. Rather, it is a kind of deep grounding, an interior pause beneath the surface of activity. Picture a lake, On a windy day, its surface ripples and dances chaotically, reflecting the restless motion of the air above it. But when the wind stills, the lake becomes a mirror, calm, reflective, but full of depth. So, too, with us, the stillness within does not empty us. It reveals us. It allows the deeper layers of our being, long obscured by the restless surface of life, to come into view. There is also an important distinction between stillness and numbness. To be numb is to shut down, to escape feeling. Stillness is the opposite. It requires full presence. It is an active openness to what is. When we enter stillness, we do not avoid our pain or our fears. We acknowledge them without letting them dictate our every action. In stillness, the grief we've been running from can finally speak its truth. The questions we've drowned in noise can rise without distortion. The parts of ourselves we've neglected can breathe again. This is why stillness, though often romanticized as peaceful, can be profoundly challenging. It asks us to meet ourselves without the armor of busyness or distraction. It strips us of pretense. Philosophically, the stillness within has been sought across traditions and ages. The Stoics saw it as a form of equanimity, the ability to remain undisturbed regardless of external chaos. In Buddhist thought, stillness is the fruit of meditation, the state of non-attachment in which suffering loses its grip. In Christian mysticism, it is the peace that surpasses understanding, the quiet in which the divine is encountered. In all these traditions, stillness is not passivity, it is strength. It is the unshakable center that allows one to endure storms without being shattered by them. It is the ground of wisdom because only when the mind is quiet can it see clearly. And yet, the phrase within is crucial here. We often seek stillness outside ourselves in serene landscapes and retreats from the world, in carefully curated moments of calm. But these are temporary. The deeper stillness is not dependent on external conditions. It is an interior state, portable and enduring. One can sit in the busiest city street and still be rooted in the stillness within. Conversely, one can sit in a quiet cabin in the mountains and still be consumed by restlessness. This is why the stillness within is such a profound image. It suggests that true peace is not about controlling our environment, but about cultivating an inner space untouched by the tumult around us. But how does one find this stillness? Often, it comes in moments of surrender when we let go of the compulsive need to fix, to solve, to assert. Think of someone who has fought against grief for months, trying to outrun it, only to finally collapse into acceptance. In that surrender, there is stillness. Or consider an artist who struggles for days to force inspiration until they release their grip and allow the creative flow to come naturally. Stillness is rarely achieved by willpower. It emerges when we relinquish the exhausting performance of control and trust the quiet wisdom beneath our fears. And yet, stillness is not static. It transforms us. To dwell in the stillness within is to shift our relationship to the world. Decisions made from a restless mind often spring from fear or ego. Decisions made from stillness are marked by clarity, compassion, and courage. This is why stillness is so vital. It recalibrates us. It allows us to see what actually matters, stripping away the noise of urgency and revealing the essence of things. From this place, our words become more deliberate, our actions more aligned with our deeper values. Stillness also has a temporal dimension. To enter it is to step outside the relentless forward march of time. In stillness, the past loosens its grip, the future loses its demand, and we rest fully in the present. This can be terrifying for those who live tethered to what was or what will be, but it can also be liberating. The present moment, fully experienced, is where life actually happens. The stillness within, then, is not just psychological, it is existential. It roots us in the only place where we can truly live, now. And yet, there is a shadow side to stillness, or at least to how we perceive it. For those who have lived in constant survival, stillness can feel alien, even unsafe. When the nervous system has been trained to expect danger, quiet feels like a void that must be filled. In such cases, learning to inhabit stillness requires courage and patience. It is not a leap, but a gradual unfolding, a slow reteaching of the self that it is safe to rest, to pause, to breathe. This is why stillness, though natural, often feels like work. It asks us to dismantle the patterns that have kept us running for so long. There is also a creative dimension to this phrase. The stillness within is fertile ground. Many artists, thinkers, and innovators speak of inspiration emerging not from frantic effort, but from stillness. It is in the quiet that connections form, that ideas ripen, that the subconscious offers up its gifts. In this way, stillness is not the end of action, but its wellspring. It is the silent womb from which meaningful movement is born. Perhaps the greatest gift of stillness is that it allows us to meet ourselves, not the selves we perform for the world, but the deeper self that waits beneath our roles and identities. When we enter stillness, we find the part of us that is untouched by praise or criticism, success or failure. We find the self that simply exists worthy without condition. To touch the self, even briefly, is to glimpse freedom. And so, the stillness within is not merely a personal sanctuary. It is a source of resilience. It allows us to face chaos without losing our ground, to endure loss without being consumed, and to love without clinging. It teaches us that beneath the surface noise of life, there is a still, steady presence always available, always waiting. In the end, stillness is not about withdrawing from the world. It is about returning to it more whole. To find the stillness within is to stand in the center of life as storms and know that, even as everything shifts, there is something in us that remains unmoved. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all, that we are not merely the restless surface of our lives. We are also the quiet depths, deep, steady, and still.